This is a tutorial dedicated to basic formal ontology. I'm going to spend the first part of the tutorial talking about BFO quite generally. The initial part will be about why you should be interested in BFO. Then the main part will be an outline of the structure of BFO and how it's used. And the final part will be about the recent updates. So we are releasing BFO OWL 2.0 finally this week. We have a new GitHub site in which you can find BFO OWL and BFO OBO. And if you don't know what those are, then I will explain during the break. And the documentation that was created already in 2012 is still valid, even though the BFO OWL, for reasons which I will explain, contains only a part of the content of that documentation. However, there is a BFO first-order logic version which is in progress, which contains all of what is contained in that documentation. And I will again explain all of those aspects if people are unfamiliar with either OWL or OBO or first-order logic during the break. So, as you can see from the handout, there is a book which will appear on August the 17th called Building Ontologies with Basic Formal Ontology. The idea behind this book is to illustrate not only what BFO is, but also how you use it to build ontologies. And so I'm going to attempt to demonstrate similarly in this tutorial how you use BFO to build ontologies. Ontology for a long time has been an area where, as this gentleman points out, an area where people engage in black arts. There were, for a long time, no rules for building ontologies. People would build ontologies for fun. People would build ontologies without really knowing what other people were doing when it came to building ontologies. And the result was a kind of anarchy. So this is linked open data, March 2009. The version of linked open data today is much, much more of a hairball than this. At the top, you have the Music Brains ontology, which was put together by teenagers with their rock music collections. And then down here, you have the protein database, which was put together by scientists in order to capture information about proteins. And this linked open data was declared to be a great victory for linking and for publishing data, when in fact the links are, in some cases, very, very weak. Moreover, the virtues of having ontologies for describing data are not really captured here because each area of ontology activity in this landscape builds ontologies in different ways. And so the only way you can take advantage of the linked open data, as the experts in linked open data will tell you, is through considerable manual effort, usually involving not sleeping. So the idea behind BFO is that we can resolve this problem of black arts and anarchy and general chaos and wasting people's time by having standards for building ontologies which everyone will share, which everyone will be willing to share because the standards are relatively neutral. And by neutral, I mean primarily domain neutral. That is to say, the same standards can apply in all domains, whether it's music or proteins. As you will see on the handout, John Fox says, I now have a much more positive story for my students because the book describes how ontologies ought to be built in a way which seems to be systematic and simple. So the idea behind BFO is that it should be something that everyone can get hold of and use in building ontologies so that there is a certain common basis for the ontology building work that they do. Now, having said all of that, I'm going to say something which will be the nearest that we get in this tutorial to what we might think of as philosophical rocket science. So BFO has a certain background. The background starts with the distinction between universals and particulars, as we say, and that is also describable by using the terms kind and instance. So a universal is a general category, something like mouse or human being or table or planet. And a particular is an instance of a general category. This particular mouse or that particular human being or these particular planets which make up the solar system. BFO is about universals, but it applies to all the instances of those universals because they are instances of those universals. My view is that all ontologies should be about universals. That's the point of ontologies. Ontologies are designed to capture what is general across a given domain, where databases primarily capture what is particular. And the history of the treatment of universals involved taxonomies of the sort that you find in Linnaean biology. And modern-day ontology is recognizably in the same tradition as old-fashioned taxonomies. But modern-day ontologies involve not just taxonomical relations, and the primary taxonomical relation is a subkind of. So mouse is a subkind of mammal. Mammal is a subkind of animal. Ontologies also involve other relations, including parthood relations. Leg is a part of organism. Every leg is a part of some organism. Also, we have not only part of relations, we have other kinds of relations, including, for instance, topological relations. Leg is connected to torso. Heart is connected to artery, and so on. And then finally, and all of these are present in very, very simple forms in BFO, we have dependence relations. Now, dependence relations have to do with, for instance, the relationship between a headache and a head. You can't have a headache without a head. The headache is dependent upon the head. Similarly, your height is dependent on you. So dependence is sometimes also called inherence, and we will meet various varieties of dependence as we go along. Now, all of these ideas are captured in various philosophical works, including Aristotle's categories at the beginning, and then increasingly as time goes by, they are captured in various works in the area of bioinformatics and then also in other areas of informatics. The closest to BFO of all the bioinformatics ontologies developed is the foundational model of anatomy, which both influenced BFO and was influenced by BFO. One part of the origin of BFO was a meeting which was held in 2004 in Leipzig. It was called the Formal Architecture of the Gene Ontology. And at this meeting, there was a confrontation, if you like, between the philosophical community, represented by people like me, and the gene ontology community, represented by the leaders in the field of the gene ontology. I gave a talk at this meeting called Stop. These are some of the other talks at the meeting. So Michael Ashburner was there, Susie Lewis was there. Some of these other names I'm sure you will recognize. STOP stands for Smart Terminologies via Ontological Principles. And in this talk, I went through the gene ontology and I showed how the gene ontology, even though it is a phenomenal success already in 2004, it was used by many, many people as a vehicle to describe microarray data, genomic data about genes and gene products in many organisms. Even though it was such a phenomenal success, it was full of mistakes. And these mistakes were very easy to point out, and as soon as they were pointed out, they were recognizably mistakes. So one kind of mistake is referred to in the literature of ontology as ISA overloading. So you remember I said the main relation in taxonomies is a subkind of, which is abbreviated as ISA. And the problem is that people use ISA to mean several different things and not just is a subkind of. And when they do that, then the ontologies don't meld together. We can't integrate the data by using the ontologies because the ontologies are built on the basis of different or differently coherent principles. So, these are some examples from the gene ontology as it then was. Lytic vacuole within a protein storage vacuole is a protein storage vacuole. Now this is like saying a timeout within a baseball game is a baseball game. It's wrong. Or an embryo within a uterus is a uterus. That's also wrong. Now, the gene ontology made mistakes like this because they were not thinking clearly about the principles which define how ISA is to be used. And BFO is designed to capture those principles. There are many similar problems in the gene ontology as it was in 2004. Since then, it's got a lot better because the people who maintain the gene ontology have accepted these principles. Now, the gene ontology, as I think you all know, consists of three sub-ontologies: a cellular component ontology, a molecular function ontology, and a biological process ontology. Now, cellular components are things like people, mice, and planets, and tennis balls, and tables. Cellular components are things, that means that they endure through time. Sometimes for a longer period of time, sometimes for a shorter period of time, but a cell nucleus will be existing at one time, existing at a somewhat later time, and it will be the same thing, the very same nucleus, which exists at the earlier time and the later time. That's a characteristic of things. You are all things, objects. Processes, on the other hand, do not exist at one time and then at another time. They exist in phases. The phase of a process occurs now, and then a later phase occurs at a later time. The process unfolds through its phases. They have beginnings, middles, and ends. You do not unfold through phases. Your life unfolds through phases. Now, this dichotomy between things and processes is absolutely central to BFO. So this is the most basic dichotomy that BFO recognizes, the difference between continuants, which continue, and occurrents, which occur. And this is captured in the gene ontology, at least as some of us would interpret it. We have continuants such as cellular components, and we have occurrents such as biological processes. Molecular functions are a little bit difficult, particularly because the gene ontology added the word activity to the names of their molecular functions, which makes it look as if molecular functions are actually processes, which might better be called functionings. But don't think about molecular functions for the moment. Think about the function of your heart. The function of your heart is to pump blood. The functioning of your heart is a process of pumping. The function is the same from the beginning to the end of the existence of your heart. So it's a continuant. Your heart's function begins to exist when your heart begins to exist and ceases to exist when your heart ceases to exist. And it's the same function through the entirety of your life, just as you are the same organism through the entirety of your life. What we did was we created a domain-neutral ontology which would have the same three-part framework as the gene ontology. We have things, attributes, processes. Attributes include functions. Things include also parts of things, cellular components, cytoplasm, and so forth. And processes are processes, events, happenings, things which occur, entities which occur. And then there are two kinds of entities, two major kinds of entities, continuants and occurrents. This is pretty much BFO. There is some space and some time. You can see on your handout, you can see the current architecture of BFO. It looks more complicated than this, but if you can capture this, you have captured the heart of BFO. The gene ontology was very successful. The meeting in Leipzig occurred in 2004. In the wake of that meeting, there was a collaboration between the originators of BFO and the editorial responsible people in the gene ontology community. And we worked out a strategy to extend the successful achievements of the Go into other areas of biology. This strategy had already been started by the gene ontology, but without the principles for coordinated development of ontologies, which BFO provided. And so we started work on things like the protein ontology, the cell ontology, and so forth. And we created the OBO Foundry, which was described in this paper published in 2007, which has co-authors not just from the gene ontology community and from the foundational model of anatomy community, but also from what became the OBI, Open Biomedical Ontologies community, and so on. And you can see on your handout a picture of the OBO Foundry. This is the original picture that we created. This is, if you like, the 13 original states of the OBO Foundry, the first colonies that we homesteaded in the long march towards taking over the whole of the life sciences, and now even further. So the gene ontology is marked in yellow. The gene ontology covers cellular components. The cell ontology covers cell types, types of cells, whole cells. We still don't really have a cellular function ontology. We're beginning to have an organ function ontology. All the other pieces of this diagram are occupied, more or less appropriately occupied. But the diagram gets bigger as time goes by. But the organization of the diagram remains the same. So we have very small things, such as molecules at the bottom. And we have larger things as we proceed towards the top. So that's a granularity axis. And then we have the BFO trichotomy between independent continuants, dependent continuants, and occurrence along the horizontal axis. So these are attributes, these are things, and these are processes. Now, this idea of coordinated development of ontologies, and we can think of these ontologies as modules. So this is modular ontology development. Modules means non-redundancy. The ontologies don't overlap. The cell type ontology deals with cell types. The Go cell component ontology deals with cell components. And those two ontologies do not have any terms in common, in principle at least. So this idea was extended in other areas, including the infectious disease ontology. Now we have the Plantiome suite of common reference ontologies for plants. And in each of these cases, several of the OBO Foundry ontologies are taken, but then they're expanded in a granular way in specific areas, for instance, areas of plant science. This is the crop ontology suite. So we have plant trait ontologies for many plant species now. We use the phenotype ontology for plant attributes, qualities. We have a plant disease ontology. We have a plant development stage ontology. We use the Go biological process ontology. So the reuse of ontologies is part of the methodology here. We have a plant anatomy ontology. We have a rather rudimentary plant cell ontology, but we can use also the cell ontology itself, which has a much richer repertoire of cell types, and so on. Molecules we can just steal. And now the whole thing is being expanded much further. So now we have the United Nations creating an ontology suite, which is modeled on the OBO Foundry. The United States Geological Survey has just embraced this idea. The Army, indeed NATO in principle, has embraced the idea. And the Federal Highway Administration is working on a suite of ontologies using the same methodology. Now, all of these efforts reuse BFO. So BFO is the domain-neutral core for multiple efforts to create modular frameworks of ontologies which are developed in tandem with each other. Coordinated development of modular ontology. So this is a part of the list. There are now more than 150 ontology groups who are using BFO. And you can find this list on the BFO website. I said that the OBO Foundry framework was being extended. It was extended to include environments with the ENVO ontology. It was extended to include experimental protocols and everything which has to do with those processes which are involved when we carry out biomedical investigations in the OB ontology. And then when we developed OB, we realized that we needed an ontology for describing information artifacts such as publications, databases, protocols themselves. And this ontology should not be part of OB because the ontology of publications is not restricted to biomedical publications. And so we created the information artifact ontology, which it goes here, which is about things like software algorithms, data, publications, footnotes, punctuation marks, margins, HTML pages, and so forth. And the interesting thing about IAO, as you can see, is that it broke BFO. Because information artifacts are not independent continuants. My passport is an independent continuant, but the information artifact, which is my passport, it's information content rather than information paper. It's not an attribute of an independent continuant in the way that a quality or a function is, and it's certainly not a process. So a publication is not a process. The process of publishing is a process. And so this created BFO 1.1. BFO 1.1 added an extra category in addition to the three we've already seen. And I'll talk about that in more detail in a minute. This is the principle. So BFO claims to be a domain-neutral ontology which can be used for ontology as a top-level starting point for any ontology endeavor. And it claims to be universal, but it doesn't claim to be complete. And if somebody comes along with an entity type, a universal, or a family of universals, which don't fit into this scheme, then we would be obliged to extend the scheme to cope with universals of that kind. So far, we have been forced to extend BFO really only once. We have made a number of changes to create BFO 2.0, but they were not radical changes in the way that this was a radical change. All right, now IAO was similarly successful. So the BFO is the most reused ontology of all the ontologies that we know about. IAO is almost certainly the second most reused ontology because it's very, very useful for all kinds of informatics-driven science, because all such science involves things like databases and publications and so forth. And so this is a list of some of the ontologies which build on IAO in the same way that the FMA, for instance, builds on BFO. All right, so that's the end of part one, and we'll have a break now for questions, if there are any. Yes?
How do you divide diseases between continuant and occurrent? If it's curable, is it occurrent? If it's
Nope. All diseases are continuants, as you will know if you get one. The treatment is an occurrent, and every disease has a disease course. It starts small, maybe it's covert, you don't even know you have it. Gets worse and worse. You go to the doctor, he gives you a treatment, and then you die, or get better. So this is the summary, which distinguishes BFO from other top-level ontologies. So first of all, the BFO is designed to be simple and small. So it will never get much bigger than what you see on the top half of your handout, because it's designed to support integrating information across domains. And if you have to go through an expensive process of learning a new big upper-level ontology before you can start doing your domain ontology work, then few people will go through that process. So it's deliberately designed to be simple. Secondly, and here we are taking a purely practical approach, turning on the fact that the ontology of mathematics is very, very difficult. We don't have any terms to describe mathematical entities, such as numbers or Lebesgue measures or Hilbert spaces. So we restrict BFO to those, basically to those things which have molecules, or perhaps smaller physical parts than molecules, or which involve molecules in processes. So we don't have anything which is not involved in a process or has molecules as parts. So no numbers and so forth. No propositions in the logical sense. No meanings in the logical sense. And again, that's because, as philosophers will tell you, the philosophy of language is very hard. Now, we are beginning to extend IAO into an ontology of linguistics, which will include things like speech acts. But that's work for the future. For the moment, we are holding on to this idea that there are no abstract entities within the framework of BFO. Finally, there are, as should be clear by now, there's no overlap between BFO and ontologies for specific domains. There's no physics in BFO, there's no sociology in BFO, there's no psychology in BFO. The terms of BFO are domain neutral. They're terms like object and process. Now, in this BFO is different from both Dolce and Sumo. So these are the three most used upper-level ontologies. Dolce and Sumo are not domain neutral. Dolce contains a little bit of sociology, a little bit of anthropology, human beings, and so forth. Sumo contains a little bit of physics, a little bit of biology, so they have the term crustacean. They are not cleanly separated from domains. Also, Sumo has a lot of mathematics, which makes it somewhat difficult and larger a lot larger than BFO. BFO is a small ontology which has been used in a lot more projects than either Dolce and Sumo. So far, primarily in biology, but now increasingly in other areas. Now, I already mentioned these fundamental dichotomies as the three fundamental dichotomies of BFO. So continuant versus occurrent, dependent versus independent, and universal versus instance. Now, the instances are down here. So this is you and this is me. Sorry, this is you and this is me. And this is me, this is my arm, my finger moving now. So my finger moving is an instance of process. Now we are concerned about instances, but we represent instances in terms of what is general about those instances, what is repeatable. So finger is repeatable. There are many fingers, and so we have a term finger, which goes under independent continuant, and then all the fingers in the universe are instances of that universal finger that is represented by that term finger. So we have terms in the ontology which represent universals which have instances in reality. And you'll notice that in that statement I did not use the term concept. And I did not use the term concept just then either. I mentioned it. I didn't use it. I never used the term concept. People who use the term concept are often not clear about what they mean by the term concept, and so I don't use it. And I recommend that you don't use it, but BFO doesn't use it either. All right, now, as I said, we moved BFO, the content of BFO, just this week to GitHub because that's where all the other OBO Foundry ontologies are being moved. And you can find it here. And you can also find details here about the release of BFO OWL 2.0 and BFO OBO 2.0. There are various benefits which are brought about by the coordination of ontologies which BFO makes possible. And I think it's useful to list some of these. So first of all, when people start building ontologies, they always face the same kinds of problems. And if they can just take BFO off the shelf and use it as a whole, then they don't need to reinvent the same wheel over and over again. They can be assured that they will be using a well-tested framework to start their work. A well-tested framework in which we've learned lots of lessons and in which we've codified the principles which we learned work. And those principles are captured in the book. And you'll see in there that we have 2 chapters which are devoted to best practices in terms of simple principles, traffic rules for ontology development. Another benefit is that if everyone shares the same upper-level ontology, then everyone can understand at least the basic structure used by everyone else. So they don't have to learn the internal mechanics of other people's ontologies when they need to use them, because they recognize already the structure. They can also more easily criticize each other's works because they can see how the structure has been used. And there is no significance in the fact that I put Pato here. It can also lead to innovations. So if lots of people are using the same framework and some of those people discover improvements, then everyone has a better chance of taking advantage of those improvements because they're sharing the same framework. We're starting to move down the hierarchy. We have what we now call specifically dependent continuants. So your headache is dependent upon your head. Specifically, you can't share your headache with someone else. They have their own headache. Similarly, your skin color is dependent upon you. Somebody may have a similar skin color, even exactly similar skin color, but they still have their own skin color. So that's specific dependence. Now, we distinguish 2 kinds of specific dependence. On the one hand, there are qualities, like skin color. And qualities are fully there if they are there at all. So your skin color is just there. It doesn't go in and out. It's even there in the dark. But then, on the other hand, there are what we call realizable dependent continuants, which are not there all the time. They're only there when they're realized. An example would be the function of your hand to grasp something. This function of my hand is now being realized because I'm grasping something. But it's not being realized when I'm just holding my hand loosely in the air. But I still have that function even when I'm not realizing it. So the function is a realizable dependent continuant. And then realizations are functionings, they're processes on the occurrent side rather than on the continuant side. A process of realization is dependent on the realizable dependent continuant, such as the disposition, which is dependent in turn on the bearer of that realizable dependent continuant. So my hand has a disposition to grasp things, which is dependent upon my hand. The processes of realization of that disposition are dependent on both me, or my hand, and on the disposition which they realize. And each of these has instances. So the processes of realization are instances of process, the dispositions are instances of disposition, and the bearers are instances of hand, organism, and so forth. So we can define specific dependence on the instance level. A particular entity depends on another particular entity if the first entity ceases to exist when the second entity ceases to exist. So the disposition of my hand to grasp will cease to exist if my hand ceases to exist. And on the type level, a universal specifically depends on another universal, means every instance of that first universal depends on the second universal in the sense defined here. So relations between universals are defined in terms of relations between instances. Now, this is under the hood, as it were. You can use BFO without knowing how to formulate these definitions. But the definitions are there in the documentation. So your temperature depends on you. You are the bearer of your temperature. And it depends specifically on you. It's a quality. The quality of whiteness of a piece of cheese depends on the cheese. The role of the lecturer depends on the lecturer. It's a realizable, specifically dependent continuant. And then the disposition of this patient to get diarrhea is dependent upon the patient. Now, somewhat more complicatedly, you're examining flies, you're looking at fly eye phenotypes. So you see an instance of an eye in a particular fly, and that instantiates the universal eye, and you see that the eye is red. So you see a specific case of redness in this particular eye, and that instantiates the universal red. And then red is a color, and eye is an anatomical structure. So when you see an eye, you also see an instance of anatomical structure. And when you see a redness, you also see an instance of color. So instance inherits through the taxonomical hierarchy of the ontology. And at the very top, we have independent continuant, which is the universal in BFO, the universal category, to which anatomical structure belongs as a subtype. And we have quality, which is the BFO category, to which color belongs as a subtype. Now we have reciprocal dependence in BFO 2.0. For instance, the hue, the saturation, and the brightness of a color depend upon each other. You can't have the one without having the other two. And now, these are the three subtypes distinguished by BFO of realizable dependent continuants. Now, this is not necessarily an exhaustive list. There may be other realizable dependent continuants which BFO needs to recognize also. BFO doesn't claim to be complete. It claims to be all-embracing. It wants to be complete. But if somebody needs a fourth kind of realizable dependent continuant, and if they make a good case, then we would add that to the list. Roles, you all understand, I think. The role of this particular water here to be, well, it's not lunch, but it's liquid breakfast, is something which the water has, but it needn't have had. So roles are optional. a particular virus which infects somebody, or a particular colony of viruses which infect somebody, plays a pathogen role, but they didn't need to play that role. Dispositions are, I think, pretty clear. So the disposition of a glass to break the fragility may or may not be realized depending on whether you break the glass. A risk factor in a disease represents some kind of disposition on the part of the bearer of that risk factor to get that disease. And then functions we've already talked about. So pumping, unlocking, grasping, seeing, hearing. And we say that functions are special kinds of dispositions. And we'll come to that in a minute. So these are examples of realizable dependent continuants, and they're all continuants. They all endure through time, and they get realized in processes of executing, expressing, exercising, manifesting, and so on. And so we can define what it is to be a student. X is a student at a given time if X is a bearer of the student role. And the student role is a subtype of the more general type role. This is the way in which BFO deals with those kinds of taxonomies which apply to entities only for certain phases in their existence. So if you're a human being, you're a human being at every point in your existence. If you're a student only for some points of your existence. Probably not when you're first born, for instance. Some ontologies don't have this, and so they have peculiar taxonomies which include employer, employee, patient, organism, all on the same level. And that means that you have redundant hierarchies, which brings all kinds of problems, some of which we will recognize later on. Now we have here a definition of role. Roles are externally grounded realizable entities. By externally grounded, we mean grounded in the context, which might be a social context. Somebody is a student because they're in a particular social context. Somebody is a nurse because they're in a particular social context. And they don't have to be in that context. So they can leave that context without being changed physically. A disposition is an internally grounded realizable entity. So it has to do with the physical makeup of the entity in question. You can only have the disposition to grasp if you have a certain kind of physical structure. You can only have the disposition to sweat or to go gray or to sleep if you have a particular kind of physical structure. And you can't lose the disposition without being physically changed, where you can lose a role without being physically. And then a function is a disposition which is designed or selected for. So it's designed by a designer, for instance, in the case of a laptop or a screwdriver or a table, or it's designed through evolutionary selection in the case of an arm or a heart or a brain. So things have functions only if they are designed or selected for. And as far as we know, there are only two ways in which things can be designed or selected for. Either because they're artifacts, designed or selected for by a maker, or because they are parts of organisms, as in the case of the heart or the hand. In addition to the categories which you see on your handout, there are also various relations which BFO recognizes. And we can divide these relations into two families. On the one hand, there are foundational relations, such as is-a and part of, which are, like the rest of BFO, completely domain neutral. So is-a and part of apply to all kinds of domains. But then there are what we call shortcut relations, which are defined in terms of foundational relations for specific domain purposes. So is a membrane part of, it means is a membrane and is part of. That's its definition. And these shortcut relations prove very useful when it comes to organizing domain ontologies, but they are, in principle, eliminable. You don't need them because you can just replace them with the expanded version of the corresponding relation. Just looking at binary relations, so the full story here would have to deal also with relations which are more than binary. We have, on the one hand, relations between types. Human is a mammal, human heart, part of human. Then we have relations between instances and types. So the obvious example here is instance of, but there are other examples, such as allergic to, knows about. So I know about furniture. I know about tables. That means I know something about the universal table. And that's a relation between me, an instance, and a universal. I guess somebody could love a universal. And then we have relations between instances. Mary's heart is part of Mary, or Mary's aorta is connected to Mary's heart. Now, as I already explained earlier, the type-level relations are defined in terms of they presuppose the corresponding instance-level relations. So to say that A is a part of B is to say that all instances of A are instance-level parts of some instance of B. This is the all-sum rule. And it's illustrated by, for instance, human heart, part of human. That's the relation between one universal and another universal. And similarly, to say that big A has participant big B is to say that all instances of big A have some instance of big B as a participant. So, for instance, every case of cell binding has a participant, some case of cell. Now, there are problems with what you see on this slide. The first problem is that for continuants, part of is time indexed, in some cases at least. So you may have a car, and you replace a tire. The tire is part of the car, but only for some times in the history of the car. The car has the tire as part only for some times in the history of the car. And now if we add that time index, we turn part of, for continuance, into a ternary rather than a binary relation. Now that's a problem because OWL, the web ontology language, really only works well for two-place relations. And so we have quite considerable and quite strenuous efforts ongoing to find a natural way of dealing with part of relations for continuance in a way which will allow OWL to capture the corresponding relational information. And we still have not really succeeded in doing that. We know what the strategies are. There are strategies. That they all have problems. Either they are too difficult for normal human beings to comprehend, or they're wrong. We are, in the course of working on BFO 2.0, at the point where we are ready to release a compromise version, which is right, which is simple to understand, but which doesn't capture everything that we would like to capture. And you can find that simplified version on the GitHub site that I mentioned earlier. The second problem with assertions like this, so human heart, part of human, is that it's not universally true. There are human hearts which are not parts of humans because they're in freezers or they're in the battlefield lying around. And for this reason, we need to understand how we're going to deal with what is called the canonical. So this is a strategy underlying many of the ontologies in the OBO Foundry, and I think it's a general strategy which has to be adopted in some form by practically every ontology project. And the strategy, which was invented by Cornelius Ross, who was the principal author of the foundational model of anatomy, which I mentioned earlier, and it goes like this. You want to build an anatomy for human beings, and you know that all human beings, practically speaking, have hearts, 2 eyes and 2 kidneys, a nose, and so forth. And so you put all of those things in your canonical anatomy. And you assert universally that, canonically, human heart, part of human. Human being has part, heart, and so on. But then you have what is called instantiated anatomy. And instantiated anatomy is what applies to instances. And whilst in the canonical anatomy, human being has part 32 teeth, in instantiated anatomy, some people, particularly males, have fewer than 32 teeth because they got into fights. To describe instantiated anatomy in a finite time, you need to use canonical anatomy together with relations such as lax part. If you try to describe every possible combination of parts in every instance of the type human being, your ontology would be way too large to be manageable. And so you create a manageable ontology which represents the canonical cases, and then you describe the deviations from the canonical cases as deviations from that anatomy. And the canonical here means that which is determined by the canonical structural genes which nearly all human beings share. When we say human heart, part of human, or human has part heart, we're talking about the canonical human being, or that which is represented in canonical anatomy. And I think that's a good place to pause for questions. So are there questions? Yep. Well, I guess this would be a good place to introduce the distinction between reference ontologies and application ontologies. Reference ontologies are typically canonical ontologies, but then people build application ontologies for specific cases. For instance, application to genetic heart defects. And then you use the canonical ontology, but you define the application ontology for the specific family of deviations that you need. There you need to be formally very precise in distinguishing canonical statements from statements in the application ontology, and I'll talk about that later on. The original goal of BFO 2.0, OWL, so we're talking now about the OWL representation, was to incorporate all the foundation relations into the BFO OWL representation. The compromise is to incorporate only the uncontroversial relations into BFO. The more difficult ones are to be found in the relation ontology, which will now be maintained carefully in such a way that we will find it easier to import the final representations of the corresponding relations into BFO OWL 2.1, which will be released in a finite time. All right, so we've seen that there are specifically dependent continuants, qualities on the one hand, functions, roles, dispositions on the other hand. Now we need to introduce generically dependent continuants. Specifically dependent continuants are clear. Your headache is specifically dependent upon you. But we know that there are dependent continuants which can be migrated from one bearer to another. And a good example is an email message. An email message is a certain pattern, which is a quality in BFO terms. It's a pattern of pixels, for instance, and we can send the email message from one screen or from one server to another server or to another screen or to another laptop, and the content of the email, indeed the pattern of the email, migrates from one bearer to another. Another case of the same sort, it occurs when we have a chromosome which is shared, which migrates, as it were, across many, many cells. We have two kinds of generically dependent or copyable dependent continuants. On the one hand, we have information entities, and on the other hand, we have things like nucleic acid sequences. Now, there may be others. It's possible that we think of organizations as being generically dependent in the same way, organizational patterns. But we'll deal with just these two, because these are the two which are most uncontroversial. we have GDCs, which are generically dependent continuants, and SDCs, which are specifically dependent continuants. We have, for instance, a plan specification. So I write a plan, a protocol for a certain kind of assay, which I'm going to perform in a certain lab. The plan specification gets concretized in patterns of ink on my piece of paper where I write down the plan. So the patterns of ink are a quality in BFO terms, which concretize, they make concrete the plan specification, which can be then entered into a computer by means of a keyboard, and then it can exist also as another pattern of slightly less scruffy pixel marks rather than ink marks. So the same plan specification is concretized now in two different places. On the one hand in the piece of paper, and on the other hand in the laptop. And then I email it to 338 people, and now it's concretized 340 times, for the moment at least. Actually, probably more, because it gets concretized by servers all the way along. And then somebody reads it, and then it gets concretized finally in somebody's head. And that somebody may then say, oh, I'm going to perform this assay. And they embrace the plan specification as an actual plan. And then they do the assay in that they realize the plan. So the plan is a realizable dependent continuant which is in somebody's head. The plan gets realized by actions of performing the assay in a lab. Now, similarly, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is a pattern, a generically dependent continuant, which we know can be realized in multiple different performances. And it can be concretized in multiple different scores. So this is an instance of the type symphony, which is a subtype of the type musical work, which is concretized in patterns of ink marks borne by scores. The score is like a plan. In fact, it's an instance of the type OB plan specification. And it specifies how to create a performance, just as the protocol of an experiment specifies how to create an investigation, a realization of the plan. The score is realized in the performance. So the score is the plan is realized in the performance, bangs and whistles. And then also for the experimental protocols, so you have a protocol which is an instance of the type plan specification, which is concretized in a plan in the mind of the leader of some team, which this plan is a realizable specifically dependent continuant in that person's head. The realization of the plan involves creating a series of subplans, because it's a multi-person experiment, which get realized in, which get concretized in the minds or heads of multiple team members. And then the experiment itself is the sum of all the realizations of these subplans. And it has outputs which are generically dependent continuants in the form of publications, databases, and so forth. So now we're down to here. We have specifically dependent continuants. We have generically dependent continuants, which are information artifacts and sequences. Functionings are realizations of functions, and things like experiments are realizations of plans, which are dispositions which are concretized, which are dispositions which are determined by plan specifications which are concretized, for instance, in patterns on screens which are read by people who thereby adopt the plan and realize it in certain actions. And now we are getting closer and closer to capturing what is here. So we have all of this here. So we don't have boundaries and temporal regions, and we don't have spatial regions, and we don't have objects and object parts, but we'll come to those next. So now we'll have a pause for questions.
So it's some point you corrected yourself from mind to head. It is
I wasn't correcting myself. I was trying to cover all my bases.
Yeah. So what is mind?
That ex officio BFO has no view on that matter. You can choose your own view about minds. We are working on a series of ontologies for neurological, psychological, and psychiatric phenomena. And so far we've managed to do quite a lot of work without having to commit ourselves on views like that. So one goal of this work is to be neutral. One even more important goal is to avoid old with a big O, philosophical with a big P issues that philosophers have been worrying about for centuries.
No, I was just asking that these things, these plans are realized in the head of a person?
The plan exists in the head is the best I can do. So you want breakfast. You wake up, you want breakfast. You have a plan in your head to go and make breakfast.
Physically in my head?
I didn't say physically. I didn't say much more than in. Actually, I think it's spatially in your head. But I don't want to go further than that. Yep.
So why is the plan specification an individual rather than, or so have you considered the possibility that a plan specification could be a universal which is instantiated in?
Yes, so that can't be right. So it's tempting to say that War and Peace, which is a novel written by Tolstoy, is a universal, and all the copies are instances. That means that Tolstoy created a universal, which is made of, 470,000 characters. And that doesn't seem right. It would mean also that universals came in different editions, which also doesn't seem right. So I think that information artifacts are instances. So Tolstoy created an instance of the kind novel, and that instance has many concretizations, which are all the copies in the original manuscripts. So we have novel, copy. And the copies are actual books. So that's an instance. This is an actual book. There's an actual book. Or they are PDF files. PDF file number 4307B. That's an instance of the kind copy. And then we have novel. War and Peace is an instance of novel. Now, War and Peace, instance of. War and Peace is not a physical thing. It's neither a book made of paper and ink, nor is it a PDF file made of bytes in somebody's laptop. Rather, it's a creation that can be concretized in many different copies. And there are other novels, so I'm told. The Hound of the Baskervilles is a novel. So there are two novels, and there are many, many, many copies of each of them.
Is the translation in this case from Russian to English a copy?
The translation is a copy of the translation, and it may be that translation of novel is another universal. I don't know. Then that would have many copies. I mean instances, each of which would have many copies. And there could be different translations of War and Peace, so including into French.
Peace, it's war and world.
War and?
For peace and world is one term in Russian.
Oh, I see. War and world.
Already to translate peace is wrong.
Yeah, we're all used to War and Peace, so it sounds nicer. Now, we in the original BFO 1.0, 1.1, we had two kinds of boundaries, Fiat boundaries and physical boundaries or bona fide boundaries. In the new 2.0, we have decided only to allow Fiat boundaries. And I will explain what this means now. So this is a boundary here of this table. But if we examine the table at the microscopic level, then we see that actually there is no one surface here, that rather there is a humming, buzzing confusion of microphysical particles. But still, we like to think that there is one tabletop and that we can put things on this one tabletop. And it's very useful for many kinds of data-driven purposes to have one entity, which is the surface of a table, or the surface of somebody's chest through which a surgeon has to make an incision. It's useful to have a word for that. But it's not the physical boundary, it's what we call a Fiat boundary. And I will explain what that means in a minute. So all boundaries in BFO 2 are Fiat. This is a list of some boundaries: the anchored anatomical plane, the craniocervical plane, the posterior plane of the oral orifice. I can sort of imagine what that is. The thoraco-abdominal plane. These are lines drawn through the organism to correspond to lines that you might draw in a diagram of the organism. But they don't correspond to any discontinuities in the physics of the organism. They are just convenient lines to draw in order to enable, for instance, the lower gut and the upper gut, or the lower tibia and the upper tibia and the mid tibia, to be distinguished from each other. So an example, it could be the mouth of an organism, but if it's the mouth of a cave, then there is a Fiat boundary separating the cave from the exterior of the cave, and there is a physical boundary separating the cave from the rock on either side. Now, we don't care about the physical boundary. We treat all of these boundaries as Fiat boundaries just for convenience sake. So we have here continuant Fiat boundary, which is an immaterial entity. And we have object, Fiat object part, object aggregate, which are material entities, which means made of molecules, roughly speaking. And this means is not made of molecules, but is still a continuant and is still tied very closely to the associated material entities, because you can't have a Fiat boundary without having some physical thing which it's related to. Now, the cave itself is, in BFO terms, a site. Lisbon is a site. This room is a site. Lisbon is also a mound of buildings. I don't want to go into any earthquake history, but by mound I mean an organized collection of buildings and roads and so forth. That is a material entity. But Lisbon, the city in which you can live and move, is a site. So that Lisbon is actually ambiguous from BFO points of view. It refers both to the site where people live and to the collection of buildings and roads and so forth which people touch and walk on. Now, there are sites which have no physical boundaries of their own because they are created in relation to physical entities, material entities, which are at certain defined geographical distance from those entities. So good examples of these kinds of entities are controlled airspaces. So class A controlled airspace is above 18,000 meters from sea level. It's all Fiat boundary. There is nothing that even looks like a physical boundary here, but it's defined in terms of sea level, which does involve physical boundaries. So I talked about the ambiguity of Lisbon. This is a slide about the ambiguity of Manhattan. We can do this not just for cities and caves, but also for mouths, nostrils, cars, labs, beds, and so on. So there is getting into bed, which is getting into the site that you actually create by getting into the bed. And there is standing on the bed, which is standing on the material entity, which is the bed. Boundaries and sites go hand in hand. Wherever we have a site, we also have boundaries. Now, the boundaries need not be fixed. They could change with time. For instance, when we have a buzzard flying in the sky and it takes its environment, its range with it. Or it could be precise, it could be less precise. The boundary could be a point, for instance, the North Pole, or it could be a line, for instance, the equator, or it could be a surface, for instance, Portugal. Now, there was a debate in the BFO community for a time about why BFO needs both sites and spatial regions. Now, spatial regions we need in order to do physics. So the Earth is moving through space, and at any given point in time, the Earth occupies some specific spatial region. That spatial region can be captured by using some three-dimensional coordinate system, defined in relation to the sun, for instance, as the 0 point. So spatial regions are associated with frames of reference. Spatiotemporal regions are associated with frames of reference. Temporal regions, such as the year 2016, are defined in association with frames of reference. Sites, however, do not reflect any definition. Sites exist because there is a gap in material entities, such as, for instance, the gap created by the walls and roof and floor of this room, which we are presently occupying. And we need terms for sites because we need to talk about the environments of organisms, for instance, or we need to talk about binding sites in proteins. And we need terms for spatial regions because we need to talk about geographic locations. We need terms for temporal regions because we need to talk about calendar dates and so forth. When we talk about surfaces, we're talking about Fiat boundaries, and we don't need to make the assumption that they coincide with any physical discontinuities. There is a connection between boundaries and spatial regions. Every zero-dimensional boundary, for instance, the North Pole, is always at some zero-dimensional spatial region at any given time. And every one-dimensional boundary is always at some one-dimensional spatial region in time. The equator is always somewhere in space at any given time, and so forth. So there is an association here. And then sites are always at some three-dimensional spatial region at some time. So if you take the hull of a ship, which has cargo inside it, that's a site. The ship moves across the Atlantic, so the site moves with the ship. Spatial regions cannot move. Sites can move, and that's why we need both sites and spatial regions in BFO. Now, similarly, material entities can move, and material entities always occupy three-dimensional spatial regions. The Earth is always somewhere, just as the equator is always somewhere. And now we come to time. So just as objects like me have spatial boundaries, so processes have temporal boundaries. A race begins at a certain time and ends at a certain time. Your life begins at a certain time and ends at a certain time. The end of your life, your death, is a process boundary. Process boundaries occupy zero-dimensional temporal regions, just as processes occupy one-dimensional temporal regions. Now, we've mentioned material entities and immaterial entities. Now let's deal with them in more detail. So a site is an immaterial entity, a boundary is an immaterial entity, because they're not made of molecules. There are three kinds of material entities. The first kind is object. Now, an object is something like you or me, or this laptop, or this piece of chalk. And actually, there are three kinds of objects. Me, the laptop, and the chalk. I am an organism. I'm held together by the kinds of forces which hold organisms together. The laptop is held together by screws and glue, and the kinds of forces through which screws and glue work. And the piece of chalk is held together by chemical bonds. They are the three kinds of objects. Maybe somebody will tell me there's a fourth kind of object, which would be great. But for the moment, there are three. I recognized. Now, in addition, there are Fiat object parts. So if we take this piece of chalk and imagine dividing it in the middle, then we already have two half pieces of chalk. But neither of them is an object. Because an object is defined by the fact that given the kinds of bonds or forces which hold it together, it's maximal. I'm maximal in that sense. If I put the chalk in my mouth, I'm still maximal. If I absorb the chalk into my, whatever you do with calcium, assuming this is calcium, then I become slightly bigger, but then I'm still one object. The chalk has disappeared. Now, I am similarly two Fiat object parts. The plane going through my center of gravity divides me into two Fiat object parts. Now, we could slice me in half through that plane, but then we create two objects. Fiat object parts are always connected to other Fiat object parts. In fact, this is how we define connectedness. Connectedness is always through a Fiat plane for material entities. This table is an object, and it's held together by screws or glue. If we pull it apart, we create two objects. The base, which is metal, and the top, which is probably wood. And then we have object aggregates. Now, these two pieces of chalk form one object aggregate. So these are examples of Fiat object parts. That's the Hüferschwanzel. And that's the Riethüfer. And that's the Geschnattes Schwanzel. This is an object aggregate of three apples. Now, it's the exact sum of a plurality of objects. The core of this apple is a part of the mereological sum of these three apples, but it's not a member of this aggregate. So object aggregates have members where the objects have parts. The object aggregate can change its members over time. So there is something called IAOA, which is the International Association for Ontology and its applications. This has members. The association can gain some members and lose some members. I think that associations like that are object aggregates with some extra structure, in virtue of which the object aggregate can survive through time, even though it gains members and loses members. And examples of object aggregates in that sense are not just associations, but also populations, families, tribes, planetary systems. The object aggregate, which consists of all the items in a given automobile part warehouse. That's an object aggregate. And we even have a list of all the members. And this is part of the populations and collections ontology. Say again? Populations and communities, yeah. Yes. And this is a definition of member part of. I guess this would be a good time to break. I think we have a coffee break now. And so we meet again at 11 o'clock. So we got to the point where we were talking about objects, Fiat object parts, and object aggregates. Now, I explained that all of these are subtypes of BFO material entity, but they're not designed to be exhaustive. So there could be other subtypes. BFO does not restrict. It puts forward a proposal to serve as a common basis, but if people need more terms, which would be siblings of these, for instance, a Fiat object part aggregate, so the collection of all bones in your body might be an example, or the collection of all muscles in your body might be an example, then they can define such a term, and they can even propose that it be added to BFO if there is a general need. If you go to the BFO site, you'll find some literature. There is a paper in there which is on the classification of material entities. And there we provide much more detail about these three subkinds of material entities. Organisms, portions of matter which are solid, the piece of chalk, for instance, and engineered artifacts such as tennis balls or laptops. So these are the three major categories of object, and they're all characterized by the fact that there are certain forces or bonds which hold the object together, and that an object is maximal relative to those forces or bonds. Not all material entities are objects or Fiat object parts or material entities, because, for instance, we might have the water in a glass, which is a material entity which falls under none of those three kinds. Another feature of BFO 2.0 is the distinction between more general qualities, such as temperature, and more determinate qualities, such as 37 degrees Celsius temperature. 37 degrees Celsius temperature is a subtype of temperature. What that means is that every instance of 37 degrees Celsius temperature is an instance of temperature. So John's temperature instantiates at a certain time this subtype of the more general type temperature, but at other times it instantiates other subtypes. And so John's temperature cycles through different subtypes of the supertype temperature. And notice that there are no sharp boundaries between these subtypes. They form a continuum. So we represent them as if they have sharp boundaries, but that's an artifact of the way in which we capture measurement data. Another addition in BFO 2.0 is the addition of the universal history. The history of a material entity is the sum of all the processes taking place in the spatial region occupied by that entity. So basically, the history of an organism is the organism's life, which is defined precisely in this way. And there is a one-to-one correspondence between material entities and histories. So every history has a material entity. Every material entity has a history. Your youth is a part of your life. So your youth is a temporal part of the history of you. So I just said all of that. Histories are additive. Thus, for any two material entities, A and B, the history of the sum of A and B is the sum of their histories. So the history of you is nearly the sum of the histories of all your molecules. And it's also nearly the sum of the history of all your cells. Now, disease. I'm going to spend most of the rest of the tutorial talking about things like diseases. So just as John has a temperature which cycles through different values, so John's coronary heart disease starts differently from the way it resolves itself into some stable chronic angina. So we start with early lesions and small fibrous plaques. It may even not be such that anyone is aware that John has coronary heart disease here, but then gradually it moves. Silent infarction, surface disruption of plaque, and then unstable angina, and then resolution into stable angina. And there's a lot of treatment activity along the way. So this one thing, John's coronary heart disease, instantiates all of these subtypes of the supertype coronary heart disease at different points during the course of John's disease. The course of John's disease is a process. Basically a process of getting worse and then stabilizing. And again, we're dealing here with threshold divisions which we mark through language, but the actual changes themselves are continuous. There are no sharp divides represented by these divisions. So this is how we represent temperature. John is an organism. John's temperature is an instance of temperature. These are the universals, and these are the instances. And there is the course of John's temperature changes, so the life of John's temperature, if you like, through time, which is dependent upon John's temperature, which is a quality of John, the organism. And similarly, John's life is dependent upon John and on John's temperature and on all the other qualities of John, which are involved in the course of his life, which is a process which is an occurrent in BFO terms. Now, we talked earlier about dispositions, the disposition of a glass to break or of a human to eat. And we said that if a disposition ceases to exist, then its bearer is physically changed. Just a warning now, diseases, all diseases, trivially, are dispositions. Now, the reason why that must be so is because two people can have the very same disease. Two identical twins may have the very same disease, but one realizes the disease in a way which involves many symptoms, and the other realizes the disease in a way which involves hardly any symptoms, because the one has treatment and the other doesn't have treatment. And that means the disease is there even if it's not expressing itself, even if it's not being realized in the form of the symptoms which are normally associated with that disease, and which in many cases go to define that disease because of treatment. So the disease is not the course of symptoms, it's the disposition to have a course of symptoms, and that disposition may be blocked, or you may just be lucky. And then we have functions. The function of the liver is to store glycogen. The function of the birth canal is to enable transport. The function of the eye is to see. All those functions are dispositions, and they all too may be blocked by another disposition, namely a disease. So dispositions can block each other. Dispositions can be mutually dependent upon each other. So my disposition to experience a certain symptom because I have a certain disease may be blocked by a certain treatment. So the function of John's eye is to see, and the realization of this function is a process which is John seeing. Every disease rests upon some disorder in the organism. So some deviation from order. And that deviation is a bodily feature. It's some part of the body which is deviating from the canonical, as we referred to it earlier in the day. So there is a tiny molecular disturbance in John's liver. It's so tiny that he doesn't notice, the doctor doesn't notice. No one could notice because no one would think to look there because the disturbance is tiny. But there's still a physical disorder. And this is a part of the extended organism. The extended organism is defined as the organism plus all the things inside it, bacteria and so forth, shrapnel, false teeth, pins in your leg, and so it's a causally linked combination of physically components that is clinically abnormal. That's what we mean by disorder. Something, it might be a bodily part, it might be a quality, it might be a process of coughing or sneezing or collapsing, is clinically abnormal if it's not part of the life plan for an organism of the relevant type. That's the first criterion. So losing milk teeth is normal because that's part of your life plan. Acquiring additional teeth is abnormal. That would be very worrying. Secondly, something is clinically abnormal if it's causally linked to an elevated risk of something bad. So feeling pain, feeling ill, feeling exhausted, dying, not being able to walk, not being able to sit. So again, something is clinically abnormal if it's causally linked to something bad like that. And then thirdly, something is clinically abnormal if it exceeds a certain threshold level. And roughly speaking, by the threshold level, we mean the level which makes you want to go to see a doctor. Anatomists talk about the Bauplan, the building plan of the organism, which is built into the structural genes for an organism of that type. Now, there is also the life plan, which is built into the development and growth genes for an organism of that type. And for each organism, there is a certain universal sequence of events which will be typical or normal or canonical for organisms of that type at a relevant age. Let's suppose you have a genetic disease, so that at the age of 13, you're going to get a certain disease manifesting itself. Then that's not part of a life plan for an organism of that type. You are unlucky. you have a different life plan which deviates from a life plan, and that's true of all genetic diseases. But let me explain that these three criteria have to be simultaneously satisfied for something to be clinically abnormal. So you need to have all three of these things. That's why we talk about genetic diseases. Genetic diseases are diseases which people have because they don't share the genes that everyone else has. And we probably have to have two life plans, one for males, one for females. And we know, roughly speaking, what it is. We know that there's puberty, and we know that there's menarche and menopause and death. I mean, death is universal. And then some people deviate from that life plan because they fall under a truck at an early age, or because they have some kind of delayed puberty, or because they are prematurely aging. And we recognize those things as diseases.
So would you be willing to consider a connection between the type function and this notion of a life plan? So the life plan is something like the realization of the comprehensive function. I see some similarities.
Yeah, one axiom that I have still not found a reason to challenge is the axiom that organisms do not have functions. Now, there could be artifactual organisms which have functions. You might cultivate a bacteria in order to eat oil spills or something, and then the function of that bacteria is to eat oil spills. But naturally occurring bacteria don't have functions. We might put them to use. Similarly, we might put our friends to use in cleaning our luggage, but then it's not their function to clean our luggage. They're organisms. The function of the heart, on the other hand, is to pump blood. So it's parts of organisms which have functions, or it's artifacts. And if you have an artifactual organism, then that artifactual organism would have a function. But you and I are not artifactual organisms. Or I'm not, anyway. The large part of the story of the life plan for an organism of any type is going to be the life plan for the organs and other parts, which is going to be involving functions. So the function of the grasping is going to be part of your life plan. If you use your elbows to grasp, then that's not part of the life plan. And this is the big picture. So you start off healthy. Tiny molecular disturbance, gradually getting worse. Each day you perform a self-assessment. You ask your body, anything wrong? Body comes back, no, everything's fine. That happens every day. And then suddenly one day you do that and you wake up with a pain. And you are aware that there's something wrong. And you keep on self-assessing, pain gets worse. And then eventually you go to the doctor. So here you have a preclinical manifestation, just a pain. Here you have a clinical manifestation. This is a pain which needs to be checked. And so now you have here you have a disorder. Here you have a disorder with a symptom. And you have a representation of the symptom by the doctor who requests that who performs a physical exam. And so now he feels your stomach and determines that there is indeed something wrong. So now he has a sign, a physical sign of the disorder. A symptom is something internal that you feel. A sign is something external that the doctor can feel and measure, or you can feel and measure. And so the doctor takes a specimen, sends it to a lab, gets a lab finding, and gradually the doctor builds up a clinical picture of what's wrong with you, which leads through an interpretive process to a diagnosis. And this may involve several cycles through different lab tests. And that diagnosis then leads to a treatment plan. So you treat your disorder, and that changes the symptoms, maybe makes them worse. So you keep going round and round in circles until finally you find a treatment plan which cures you. And that's it. That's what we deal with in OGMS, which is the Ontology for General Medical Science. And now we have some more definitions. So a pathological process is a bodily process that is a manifestation of a disorder and is clinically abnormal. And a disease is a disposition to undergo pathological processes that exists in an organism because of one or more disorders in that organism. And now we can look how it works for a specific disease. So liver cirrhosis. And if you look back at the big picture, so we have, this is the etiology. You're healthy and something causes the disorder. And then you have the disease course, which is going to be affected by treatment, and which is going to be followed to a certain degree by the doctor. And then you have the therapeutic response, which follows the creation of a treatment plan. And then in the case of cirrhosis, the etiological process is hepatic cell death, which produces a disorder which is the necrotic liver, the changed liver, which is a part of your body. It's a material entity. And this liver bears a disposition which is the disease called cirrhosis. And this disease is realized in a pathological process of abnormal tissue repair and hypoxia-induced cell death. And this produces abnormal bodily features in the form of signs such as fatigue and anorexia, symptoms such as fatigue and anorexia, and signs of jaundice and an enlarged spleen. The signs can be seen by both the doctor and or the patient. The symptoms can only be experienced by the patient. And then influenza is an infectious disease. So here the etiological process is an influenza virus getting into your airway and infecting your epithelial cells. This produces a disorder which is viable cells with the influenza virus on their surface. And the disposition which is born by this disorder is flu, the disease, which is realized in processes of acute inflammation, which produces symptoms of weakness and dizziness and signs of fever.
Is this also meant to capture psychological diseases?
So this theory of disease applies to all diseases, and we can talk about psychological diseases in exactly the same way.
So
It's just that we know a lot less, typically. But you're talking about psychiatric diseases, mental disorders, as they call them. So the underlying idea behind OGMs is that all diseases, like all dispositions, have a physical base. So some people say if you have a liver cancer, then you have a carcinomatous liver, so you have a diseased liver, so the liver is the bearer of your disease. Other people will say that you have liver cancer because your liver is carcinomatous. Both of those ways of speaking are, I think, perfectly in order. So there's the narrow sense of what is the bearer of the disease, namely the liver, or here the epithelial cells, airway epithelial cells. And then there's the wider sense in which the bearer of the cancer or of the flu is the whole organism. And just to go back to schizophrenia, I think in the case of schizophrenia, it would be more difficult to use the narrow sense, but that's primarily because we don't know what precisely is the disorder which is the bearer of the disposition, which is the disease, which we call schizophrenia. And that's the characteristic difference between mental diseases and physical diseases. We know a lot more about physical diseases than we do about mental diseases, so far. Diseases are dispositions, but not all dispositions are diseases. So the disposition to go bald is not a disease, unless you're female, maybe. But then there are dispositions which we call predispositions, or risk factors, which are dispositions to diseases, which means that they are dispositions to dispositions. A predisposition is a disposition in an organism that constitutes an increased risk of the organism subsequently developing some disease. So it's a disposition to a disposition. And an example would be Huntington's disease. This is a surefire disposition. In other words, if you have it, then you always get the disease. And here the etiological process is a certain genetic inheritance which produces a disorder which is chromosome number 4 has abnormal MHTT. This bears a disposition which we call Huntington's disease, which is realized in pathological processes, which is accumulation of these protein fragments, which goes hand in hand with abnormal transcription regulation and neuronal cell death in striatum, which produces abnormal bodily features such as anxiety disposition and eventually difficulties in speaking and swallowing. Then HNPCC is a genetic predisposition which is not surefire. In other words, you can have it without ever getting the ultimate disease. And here we have a two-stage process. So the etiology is a certain inheritance of a mutant gene which produces, again, a chromosomal abnormality which bears the disease called Lynch syndrome, which is realized in a pathological process of abnormal repair of DNA mismatches, which produces a disorder which is mutations in these things, which bears the disposition which is colon cancer. That is a predisposition to getting colon cancer. This is the definition of disease which you already saw. The definition of disease course is the aggregate of processes in which a disease disposition is realized. Someone who has a disease and gets a special kind of treatment will have a different disease course from somebody who has the disease without the treatment. And then we need to classify the different disease courses according to the different treatments which are available for a given disease. And then the picture looks like this. So John has a disordered heart, which is a disorder. John, as a result, has a certain disposition, which is his coronary heart disease, which depends upon the heart for its existence. And in virtue of this disposition, which gets realized, he has a course of disease, which is the sum of processes realizing his disposition. OGMS is the ontology for general medical science. It defines all of the terms that we've been using here, including all of the terms on that picture. And we've done influenza. Notice that we also need to deal, when dealing with the disease course, not just in the bad things that happen and are painful, but also, or harmful in some way, but also in the good things which happen, which are painful. So when you have influenza, your immune system will give rise to a physiological response, which is actually most of the harmful experience that you have when you have flu. It's not the flu, it's your body curing the flu. And so OGMS has an account not just of clinically abnormal processes, but also of clinically normal processes, which are the body's normal response to the clinically abnormal dispositions which the body acquired. All right, so that's immune response, that's Huntington's disease, that's cirrhosis. This is systemic arterial hypertension, which is just elevated blood pressure, but elevated blood pressure caused not by the fact that you are under stress, but by the fact that there's something wrong with your bodily system. This is diabetes. Hypersensitivity to penicillin, so this would be an allergy case. Early onset Alzheimer's disease. Stroke. Here we have three disorders and three dispositions. So we get an aneurysm in an artery. This gives rise to a disposition. The artery is weakened, and so it is likely to disrupt. Then it ruptures, and this gives rise to another disorder, which is all that blood in your brain. That creates a disposition of increased intracranial pressure, which gives rise to a pathological process of compression of brain structures, which produces a new disorder of cerebral ischemia, and again, neurons dying, which gives rise to a disease called stroke. And that's realized in symptoms of paralysis, loss of sensation, and so forth. All right, so that's it. Thank you all very much.